My wife forged a power of attorney to sell my inherited 50-acre estate, so I faked a massive environmental crisis and left her drowning in millions of fake debt. I'm 35 years old, and I honestly believe that absolute greed is a completely incurable disease. Once it infects a family, it will absolutely destroy every single shred of loyalty, love, and basic human decency they possess. I don't know why I ever tried to be the peacemaker. When I met my wife, Sarah, about 6 years ago, she was incredibly sweet, quiet, and completely overshadowed by her absolute nightmare of a father, Richard. Richard was a 60-year-old, incredibly arrogant man who constantly bragged about his massive business acumen. The reality was that he was a completely failed commercial contractor. He had bankrupted 3 separate construction companies, had absolutely zero retirement savings, and survived entirely on high-interest credit cards while leasing expensive trucks to look like a massive success. Richard absolutely hated me from the exact moment we met. I'm a senior global logistics director for a massive shipping corporation. I make a very comfortable mid-six-figure salary, but I am incredibly frugal. I don't wear expensive watches, I don't drive massive luxury trucks, and I absolutely refuse to fund other people's terrible financial decisions. Richard constantly told Sarah that I was a cheap, boring loser who was completely holding her back from a luxurious lifestyle. I mostly just ignored him. We kept our finances entirely separate, and I completely forbade Richard from ever asking me for a business loan. But exactly 2 years ago, my grandfather passed away and completely changed the financial dynamic of my entire life. My grandfather didn't leave me a massive pile of liquid cash. He left me something significantly more valuable. He legally willed me a pristine, completely untouched 50-acre plot of commercial timberland located right on the rapidly developing edge of the city. The land was an absolute goldmine. Because of the massive urban expansion, corporate developers were desperately trying to buy up every single inch of property in that specific county. I had real estate brokers constantly calling my cell phone, offering me completely insane amounts of money. The most recent official appraisal valued my completely paid off 50 acres at exactly $2,800,000, but I didn't want to sell it. I loved that land. I wanted to build a beautiful custom log cabin right in the center of the 50 acres and retire there one day. I put the massive property deed in a heavy fireproof safe in my home office, and I completely refused to entertain any corporate offers. Richard, however, was absolutely completely obsessed with the land. Every single time he came over for a family dinner, he would corner me in the kitchen. He would demand that I sell the property to a commercial developer and let him act as the primary construction consultant. He claimed we could make exactly $5 million if we clear-cut the timber and built a massive luxury subdivision. I told him absolutely, unequivocally, no. I told him the land was a sacred family heirloom and that it was completely off-limits. Richard would turn completely purple with rage, call me an absolute idiot, and storm out of my house. I thought that was the end of it. I thought my firm boundary was completely established. I had absolutely no idea that Richard and my own wife were actively, methodically plotting to completely steal my inheritance right out from under my nose. Exactly 4 months ago, my shipping corporation sent me on a massive, highly critical logistics assignment to Europe. I was scheduled to be completely out of the country for exactly 90 days. Sarah kissed me goodbye at the airport. She cried, told me how much she was going to miss me, and promised to keep the house completely safe while I was gone. I worked grueling, 18-hour days in Europe. I barely had time to call her, but whenever I did, Sarah sounded completely happy and incredibly relaxed. She told me she was spending a lot of quality time with her father and that they were just doing some minor organizing around the house. My corporate project actually finished a full 2 weeks early. I decided to completely surprise Sarah. I didn't text her my updated flight itinerary. I just boarded the plane, flew back to the United States, and took a quiet taxicab directly to my house on a Tuesday afternoon. I walked through the front door. The house was completely silent. Sarah was out running errands. I dropped my heavy luggage in the hallway and walked right into my home office to put my passport in the fireproof safe. I opened the closet door, and my heart completely, instantly stopped beating in my chest. The heavy steel door of my fireproof safe was completely hanging wide open. I literally dropped to my knees on the hardwood floor. I frantically dug through the manila folders inside. My grandfather's antique pocket watch was still there. My emergency cash was still there. But the thick, heavy legal folder containing the absolute official deed to my $2,800,000 50-acre estate was completely gone. I didn't panic. I didn't start screaming. My absolute cold corporate logistics training immediately flooded my brain. I stood up and started completely, methodically tearing my own home office apart. I checked every single drawer. I checked the trash cans. And then I found it. Hidden underneath a massive stack of printer paper on Sarah's side of the desk was a completely brand new, thick black leather portfolio. I opened the portfolio, and the absolute, catastrophic reality of my wife's massive betrayal completely shattered my entire universe. Inside the portfolio was a completely finalized, legally binding commercial real estate contract. Sarah and Richard hadn't just stolen the physical deed. They had completely maliciously hired a completely corrupt, sleazy notary public to forge my legal signature on a massive, comprehensive power of attorney document. Using the forged power of attorney, Sarah had legally represented herself as my absolute financial proxy, and she had signed a completely ironclad, binding agreement with a massive, highly aggressive corporate land developer. The contract explicitly stated that they were selling the entire 50-acre property for exactly $2,500,000. But the absolute most sickening sociopathic part was the payment structure. The contract authorized an immediate, non-refundable cash advance of exactly $500,000 to completely clear-cut the timber. And the routing number listed for that massive $500,000 wire transfer was a completely hidden, newly opened joint checking account under Sarah and Richard's names. They had literally stolen my grandfather's legacy. They forged federal documents, completely bypassed my ownership, and pocketed $500,000 in pure stolen cash. And based on the printed emails tucked into the back of the portfolio, Sarah was planning to use her portion of the stolen money to hire an aggressive divorce lawyer the exact week I was supposed to fly home. I sat in my quiet home office, staring at the forged signature on the massive corporate contract. They thought I was just a quiet, oblivious guy who was exactly 3,000 miles away. They thought they had completely gotten away with the absolute perfect financial crime. I carefully put the documents completely back where I found them. I closed the safe, grabbed my luggage, and walked right back out the front door. I took a taxi to an expensive downtown hotel, and I called my absolute most ruthless corporate lawyer, because I wasn't just going to stop the sale. I was going to make them legally assume a massive, completely inescapable nightmare. I didn't rush back to my house to scream at her. When you work in global corporate logistics, you learn that completely flying off the handle is the absolute fastest way to lose a massive negotiation. You don't get mad. You gather your data, you secure your assets, and you completely, methodically dismantle the opposition. I sat in the plush leather chair of a massive, glass-walled conference room in downtown. My corporate attorney, a man who charged exactly $850 an hour, looked at the high-resolution photographs I had taken of the forged power of attorney and the commercial real estate contract. He took off his glasses and completely shook his head. He told me it was one of the most brazen, incredibly stupid financial crimes he had ever seen in 30 years of practicing law. He told me that by using a corrupt notary to forge a federal financial document and route a $500,000 cash advance across state lines, Sarah and Richard had completely committed massive felony-level wire fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny. We could call the federal authorities right this exact second. My lawyer told me. We could have them both in handcuffs before dinner time. I looked at him and I completely shook my head. I don't just want them in handcuffs, I told him, keeping my voice incredibly cold. I want to watch them completely panic. I want them to willingly, frantically rip up that commercial contract. I want to watch Richard's entire massive, arrogant ego completely collapse in real time. My lawyer leaned back in his expensive chair. I told him my entire plan. He actually let out a massive, booming laugh and told me it was the most brilliantly evil corporate trap he had ever legally sanctioned. Because I am a global logistics director, I deal with massive international environmental compliance regulations every single day. I know exactly what official government environmental documents look like. I have complete access to the exact legal jargon, the formatting, and the terrifying federal penalty structures. I went back to my expensive hotel room, opened my laptop, and spent exactly 7 hours drafting a completely fake, incredibly comprehensive, 90-page federal environmental assessment. The document looked absolutely 100% legitimate. It had massive, intimidating federal seals. It was filled with terrifying clauses about immediate asset forfeiture, criminal negligence, and massive financial liability. The fake document explicitly stated that the federal government had just conducted a massive subterranean soil test on my 50-acre estate. It claimed that the absolute center of the property sat directly on top of a massive, highly toxic, completely illegal chemical dumping ground from the 1970s. It stated that the land was entirely, permanently condemned. It could never be developed. But the absolute most brilliant, terrifying clause I drafted was buried right on page 4. The fake federal mandate explicitly stated that the federal government was issuing an immediate, undischargeable, mandatory cleanup fine of exactly $12,500,000. And it stated that any individual listed as the owner or anyone acting as a legally bound financial proxy attempting to sell the contaminated land was immediately personally liable for the entire $12 million debt. Furthermore, the document stated that attempting to sell the condemned property to an unknowing commercial developer carried a mandatory minimum sentence of 30 years in a federal penitentiary. It was an absolute flawless masterpiece of psychological destruction. I printed the massive stack of papers, put them in a heavy red folder, and I waited exactly 2 days to make my grand entrance. On Thursday evening, I took a taxi back to my house. I completely messed up my hair. I unbuttoned my collar, and I forced myself to look absolutely, physically exhausted and terrified. I walked through the front door. Sarah was sitting on the living room couch watching a reality TV show, probably dreaming about exactly how she was going to spend her stolen $500,000. She jumped up from the couch when she saw me. She looked completely shocked that I was home from Europe 2 weeks early. She ran over, trying to give me a massive, fake hug. I completely ignored her hug. I walked right past her, dropped the heavy red folder onto the coffee table, and collapsed into the armchair. I put my head in my hands and let out a massive, shaking groan. "Sarah," I whispered, making my voice shake with fake panic. "We are completely, entirely ruined. Everything is gone." Sarah's completely fake smile vanished instantly. She asked me what was going on. I looked up at her, pretending I was completely fighting back tears. I told her that federal agents had intercepted me at the corporate office. I told her that the federal government had just seized my grandfather's 50-acre estate. I told her the entire property was a massive, illegal, toxic waste dump and that it was entirely condemned. Sarah literally stopped breathing. The blood completely drained from her face. But then, I dropped the absolute nuclear bomb. I grabbed her hands, pretending to be completely desperate. And the worst part, I told her, my voice completely cracking, is the federal liability. They are issuing a mandatory cleanup fine of exactly $12,500,000. They told me that if anyone tries to sell that land, or if anyone acts as a financial proxy for the estate, the federal government will hold them personally, legally liable for the entire $12 million. And whoever tries to sign a commercial contract for that land will absolutely go to federal prison for 30 years. I swear. I actually watched her soul completely leave her body in real time. She went completely ghost white. She pulled her hands away from me, stumbling backward until she hit the edge of the couch. She wasn't worried about me. The absolute terrifying realization that she and her arrogant father had just legally, voluntarily forged a document to make themselves the financial proxies for a $12 million toxic waste site completely shattered her brain. She realized that by signing that commercial contract, she had just legally signed herself up for 30 years in a federal penitentiary. She started stammering, completely unable to form a coherent sentence. She told me she felt physically sick. She said she needed to use the restroom immediately. She practically ran down the hallway, completely abandoning me in my fake moment of absolute despair. I heard the heavy bathroom door slam shut, and I heard the lock click. I didn't stay in the living room. I walked completely silently down the hallway and pressed my ear right against the wooden door. I didn't have to strain to hear her. Sarah was literally screaming into her cell phone. She had called Richard. "Dad, you have to fix it." Sarah screamed, completely sobbing into the phone. "The federal government is seizing the land. The property is a massive toxic waste dump. The government says whoever signed a commercial contract for that estate is going to federal prison for 30 years and owes them $12 million. We have to rip up the contract. We have to get our names off that forged power of attorney right this exact second." I stood in the hallway, pressing my hand over my mouth to keep from absolutely laughing out loud. The trap had completely flawlessly snapped shut. They were absolutely terrified, and they were about to completely tear their own massive financial crime apart just to save their own skin. I stood completely still in the quiet hallway, pressing my hand tightly over my mouth to keep from absolutely laughing out loud. Through the heavy wooden bathroom door, I could hear Sarah and her incredibly arrogant father, Richard, completely losing their minds. Sarah was hyperventilating, repeating the fake, terrifying federal penalties I had just completely invented. She kept crying about the 30 years in a federal penitentiary and the massive $12,500,000 cleanup fine. I quietly backed away from the door, walked back into the living room, and sat down on the armchair. I put my head in my hands and went right back to playing the role of the completely broken, terrified husband who was facing a massive federal crisis. Exactly 15 minutes later, the bathroom door slowly opened. Sarah walked back into the living room. She looked like she had physically aged exactly 10 years in the span of 15 minutes. Her makeup was completely ruined, her eyes were completely bloodshot, and her hands were physically trembling so hard she could barely hold her cell phone. She walked over to me, sat down on the edge of the coffee table, and reached out to grab my hands. They were absolutely ice cold. She looked me in the eyes and she spun the most absolutely pathetic, entirely transparent lie I have ever heard in my entire natural life. "Honey," she whispered, her voice completely shaking. "I have to confess something to you. I did something a few weeks ago, and I only did it because my dad told me it would be a massive, wonderful surprise for you." I looked up at her, pretending to be completely confused. She took a massive, shaking breath. She told me that she and Richard had been incredibly worried about my stressful logistics job. She claimed that Richard had found a massive corporate developer who wanted to buy the 50-acre estate, and they wanted to handle all the boring paperwork for me so I could just come home from Europe to a massive pile of cash. And then, she actually admitted the felony. But she completely tried to spin it as a massive, loving favor to me. We forged a power of attorney, she cried, squeezing my hands. We hired a notary, and we signed a commercial contract to sell the land. We were just trying to be helpful. But now, we are the financial proxies. I ripped my hands away from her. I stood up from the armchair, and I put on the absolute greatest acting performance of my entire life. I yelled. I paced around the living room. I acted completely, utterly horrified, screaming that she had committed a massive federal felony and forged my legal signature. I yelled that she had completely ruined everything, and that now the federal government was going to arrest her and her father for attempting to sell a $12 million toxic waste dump. Sarah completely broke down. She collapsed onto the living room rug, sobbing uncontrollably. She begged me to forgive her. She begged me to help her fix it. We have to cancel the contract, Sarah screamed, looking up at me from the floor. My dad is driving over right this exact second. We have to rip up the forged power of attorney before the federal agents find out we are the financial proxies. Exactly 20 minutes later, the heavy front door flew open. Richard burst into my living room. He didn't look like an arrogant, successful business mogul anymore. He was completely sweating through his expensive dress shirt. He was absolutely pale, completely hyperventilating, and clutching the thick black leather portfolio directly to his chest. Richard didn't even try to yell at me or call me a loser. He actually marched right up to me and started completely panicking, blaming the corporate developer for the entire fake federal crisis. We have to completely invalidate this contract. Richard yelled, pointing a shaking finger at the portfolio. We cannot be legally attached to a $12 million environmental liability. I am not going to a federal penitentiary for 30 years because your grandfather bought a toxic waste dump. I just nodded my head, looking completely defeated. I told them that if they didn't completely reverse the financial transaction and legally dissolve the power of attorney right this exact second, the federal investigators would freeze all of their bank accounts by tomorrow morning. Richard completely panicked. He admitted right there in my living room that they had already received the massive $500,000 cash advance. You have to wire it back. I screamed at him, playing the terrified husband perfectly. If you hold on to a single penny of that corporate money, the federal government will charge you with massive international money laundering. Richard didn't even hesitate. He pulled out his cell phone, called his high-end banking concierge, and completely frantically authorized an immediate wire reversal. I stood right there and listened to him completely drain his secret joint account, willingly paying a massive, non-refundable wire penalty fee just to send the entire $500,000 right back to the corporate developer. He completely forfeited his stolen money out of sheer, absolute terror. Then, I told them we needed to leave for the notary immediately. We didn't ride in the same car. I drove my quiet sedan, and Sarah and Richard piled into his massive leased luxury truck. I watched them in my rearview mirror the entire drive to the sleazy notary's office. They were driving completely erratically, absolutely terrified to get the massive federal liability entirely out of their names. We arrived at the strip mall, notary office exactly 45 minutes later. We walked into the bright, fluorescent-lit room. The corrupt notary, a completely sleazy guy in a cheap suit, looked absolutely terrified when Richard slammed the black leather portfolio down onto his desk. Richard completely demanded that the notary print out a massive, legally binding document entirely dissolving the forged power of attorney and completely nullifying the commercial real estate contract. The notary didn't even argue. He saw how completely unhinged Richard was, and he printed the legal dissolution documents immediately. Sarah and Richard didn't even read the paperwork. Their hands were shaking so incredibly badly that they could barely hold the black pen. They were absolutely convinced that federal agents were going to burst through the door at any second and arrest them for massive environmental fraud. They signed their names. They legally, officially dissolved their entire proxy status. They completely surrendered any and all rights to the commercial contract, effectively ripping it to shreds. The notary stamped the document with his heavy official seal. He signed his name, officially validating the complete reversal. I reached across the cheap desk and I picked up the heavy black portfolio containing the freshly signed dissolution documents and the original physical deed to the land. I looked at the fresh ink. I felt the physical weight of the leather portfolio in my hands. The entire $2,800,000 estate was completely legally mine again. No forged signatures, no secret commercial contracts, no encumbrances. I slowly tucked the heavy portfolio perfectly under my arm, and then the entire atmosphere in the small, sleazy office instantly shifted. I didn't look terrified anymore. I stopped slumping my shoulders. I completely dropped the fake, panicked breathing. I stood up straight, completely adjusted my collar, and I looked down at my wife and her absolutely arrogant, totally defeated father. I just smiled. A completely cold, absolutely terrifying smile. And then, I dropped the absolute final hammer on their entire, completely fake reality. I stood up straight, completely adjusted my collar, and I looked down at my wife and her absolutely arrogant, totally defeated father. I just smiled. A completely cold, absolutely terrifying smile. The entire atmosphere in the small, sleazy office instantly shifted. I didn't look terrified anymore. I stopped slumping my shoulders. I completely dropped the fake, panicked breathing. Sarah looked up at me from her cheap plastic chair. Her bloodshot eyes narrowed just a fraction of an inch. She could tell something was incredibly, fundamentally wrong. "Honey?" she whispered, her voice completely shaking. "Why are you smiling? We have to get back to the house and call the federal agents. We have to tell them the commercial contract is completely dissolved." I let out a very slow, completely calm breath. "There are no federal agents, Sarah," I said, my voice completely echoing in the quiet, fluorescent-lit office. The three of them completely froze. The corrupt notary actually stopped breathing. Richard's jaw completely dropped. I looked right into Sarah's terrified eyes, and I completely dismantled her entire universe. "There is no massive federal environmental assessment," I explained, keeping my voice incredibly flat and steady. "There is no toxic waste dump from the 1970s. There is absolutely no $12,500,000 cleanup fine, and nobody is going to a federal penitentiary for 30 years. I made the entire thing up." Sarah literally stopped breathing. She stared at me, completely unable to process the words coming out of my mouth. I tapped the heavy, black leather portfolio completely tucked under my arm. "I am a senior global logistics director," I told her, my voice dripping with absolute disgust. "Did you honestly, truly believe you could secretly forge my legal signature on a federal financial document, sell my grandfather's 50-acre estate, and I would just never notice?" I found the portfolio in the office on Tuesday afternoon. I saw the forged signature. I saw the massive wire transfer routing numbers. Richard started completely stammering. His face turned violently purple. He realized exactly what I had just done. He realized I had just legally tricked them into wiring $500,000 back to a corporate developer, paying massive wire fees and completely tearing up their own stolen commercial contract. He lunged forward, screaming at the top of his lungs. He reached across the cheap desk, desperately trying to grab the leather portfolio right out from under my arm. "You completely tricked us." Richard screamed, his voice absolutely echoing off the strip mall walls. "You are a completely sick, twisted monster. That was a massive, completely legal business deal. Give those dissolution papers back right this exact second." I easily stepped back, completely out of his reach. "No," I said quietly. "It was a massive, felony-level financial crime. You forged a federal document. You committed international wire fraud. And because you were in such a massive, completely blind panic, you just legally signed away every single shred of proxy power you thought you had." I looked directly at the sleazy, corrupt notary who was completely sweating behind his desk. "And if any of you try to fight me on this," I said, making absolutely sure the notary heard me, "I have high-resolution photographs of the originally forged power of attorney. I have the emails. I have the joint banking information. I will take every single piece of evidence straight to the district attorney, and I will make absolutely sure that all three of you actually go to a federal penitentiary for real." Sarah actually let out this massive, completely blood-curdling scream. She covered her face with her hands and collapsed forward onto the folding table. She realized she had just legally confessed to a massive felony, lost a completely free $500,000, and destroyed her entire marriage in one single afternoon. I looked down at her completely shaking, sobbing form. "I am filing for divorce the exact second the courthouse opens tomorrow morning," I told her. "Do not bother coming back to my house. Your expensive clothes and your bags are already sitting in heavy black trash bags in the driveway. And if you ever, even for a single second, try to come after my corporate savings or my grandfather's estate, I will make the wire fraud charges completely official." I didn't wait for her to respond. I didn't listen to Richard's absolute, unhinged screaming. I turned around, walked completely out of the sleazy notary office, got into my quiet sedan, and I drove away. The legal fallout over the next 8 months was absolutely, incredibly brutal for her and her father, because I held the absolute, concrete proof of their massive felony forgery. Sarah didn't dare fight me in the divorce proceedings. She didn't hire an aggressive lawyer. She didn't demand a single penny of my massive corporate salary, and she absolutely did not try to claim any equity in the house or the 50-acre timberland. She signed the divorce papers completely quietly, absolutely terrified that I was going to send her to prison if she pushed back. She walked away from a completely luxurious, financially secure life with absolutely nothing but her trash bags. Richard's entire life completely catastrophically imploded. Because he had frantically reversed the massive $500,000 wire transfer, the banking institution hit him with massive, undischargeable international penalty fees. His credit was completely destroyed. The dealership immediately repossessed his massive, leased luxury truck because he couldn't make the payments. I heard through the massive family grapevine that they are completely miserable. Because they both lost their fake millions, they completely turned on each other. Sarah blames Richard for coming up with the horrible plan to steal the land. Richard blames Sarah for completely caving under pressure and confessing to the fake federal agents. They absolutely hate each other. Richard had to move into a tiny, completely run-down motel on the terrible side of town. Sarah is currently renting a cramped, incredibly depressing studio apartment, and she actually has to work a completely standard 50-hour-a-week retail job just to pay her basic utility bills. As for me, I am doing absolutely incredible. I kept my grandfather's completely pristine, 50-acre estate. I didn't sell it to the massive corporate developers. Exactly 2 months ago, I hired a completely legitimate, incredibly talented architectural firm. We are currently breaking ground on a beautiful, custom-built log cabin right in the absolute center of the timberland. I still work my massive corporate logistics job, but I sleep incredibly peacefully in a beautiful, quiet environment. I have hundreds of thousands of dollars sitting securely in my private investment accounts, entirely safe from any toxic, greedy family members. I learned an incredibly valuable lesson. The absolute best way to completely destroy an arrogant, entitled person isn't to yell at them or try to change their mind. The absolute best way is to completely weaponize their own immense, pathetic greed, step entirely out of the way, and watch them legally dismantle their own entire life.